Comparative anatomy is the process of studying similar features in different organisms. So it's looking at organisms and it's having a look at what are some of the similarities we can see in their features, and structurally what are the similarities that we can observe. So the reason why we might want to do this is because similar features can suggest that they might have similar DNA, and it's also going to shed light on evolution. So if we have two organisms that have similar features, this may lead us to believe that there are similarities in their DNA, and it can give us some sort of information about evolution and evolutionary processes. So if we look at some particular structures in some organisms, even though these structures may have different functions, they may share similar features, and they might be quite similar structurally. So what we say is if we have structures in the body which share similar features yet different functions, we can term these to be homologous, or homologous structures, or homologous features. So if we have a look here, what I've got is three different types of organisms. So firstly, here we have a whale, we also have a bat, and then we have a lion. Now on the outset, what we would say is they're probably three quite different species, very different types of animals, and they look quite different. But if we had a bit of a closer look structurally at their limbs, so we're talking about kind of the whale fin here, we'd be talking about the wing here of the bat, and then we'd be talking about kind of the leg and paw of a lion. What you actually might find is that structurally those three different types of limbs are actually quite similar. So they'll have similar type of bones, they'll have a similar layout of bones, and they'll be organized in a way in which they can actually be compared between the three different types of species. So just because they look quite different, it doesn't mean that the bone structure and the way the bones are laid out in those limbs doesn't share some similarities. So the fact that they've got these kinds of similarities within their limb structure or bone structure in the limbs gives us an idea that they may share some similarities in DNA, and depending on those similarities might give us an understanding of just how closely related they might be. Now another way we can look at relation between different organisms is by using amino acid sequences. Now the DNA of an organism is going to outline the amino acid sequence needed to create a protein. So the reason why DNA has a very specific order is because particular segments of DNA, so genes, are going to have a sequence of DNA arranged in codons, which are going to outline an amino acid sequence or order needed to create a protein. So the reason why this is helpful to us and to be able to look at relationships and evolution relationships is that there are proteins that are seen in a lot of living creatures or many living creatures. So if we have a particular protein that's seen in numerous organisms, then we can look at that particular protein that's created, and we can look at the amino acid sequence to try and determine just how closely related individuals may be. So I've come up with this made up protein called protein XYZ, and we can imagine that this protein is 100 amino acids long. So say there's 100 amino acids that make up this protein XYZ, and this is seen in a number of different organisms. So if we were to compare the protein XYZ between two humans and the amino acids, the amount of differences we would see in the amino acid sequence, the differences would be zero. So if I was to look at two different humans and there'd be no sort of outrageous mutation or anything take place, two humans would have protein XYZ with an identical amino acid sequence. When we start to compare different species, we may start to see some differences in the amino acid sequence, and what this may in turn tell us is that they are slightly less related than other species, or slightly more related than other species. So let's now imagine that we are comparing a human with a monkey. And let's imagine that Out of these 100 amino acids in the human and the monkey, 99 of them are exactly the same, but there's one location where a different amino acid is present in this protein XYZ. So there's a slight difference between a human and a monkey. Now let's look at a human compared to a compared to a lizard. So let's imagine a human and a lizard, and let's say that there are 11 differences in the amino acid sequence for protein XYZ. Now finally, let's imagine we are comparing a human and then just a type of bacteria. And in this type of bacteria, what we see is 38 differences. So 38 locations where the amino acid is different for protein XYZ. So what you can see here is if we are able to compare a particular protein, so the same protein in multiple organisms, then we're able to look at the amount of differences in the amino acid sequence to tell us how closely related particular organisms may be. So what we can tell from this is humans and monkeys, as there's only one amino acid difference, are far more closely related than humans and this particular type of bacteria. So what this will also tell us is that it's more than likely that humans and monkeys evolved more closely and speciated more recently than humans and lizards, for example, because there's been less time for mutations to take place to this amino acid sequence and for us to get difference in this amino acid sequence to arise. So what we can do with all of this information is we can compile it into something called a phylogenetic tree. So a phylogenetic tree is an arrangement similar to this, where we can actually visually look at what points different species speciated and evolved to become different species and branch off from other species. So what we can see here is, what we see up the top here is this phylogenetic tree or section of phylogenetic tree would tell us that humans and monkeys are quite closely related because they may have, in that the past example I showed you, they may have a lot of similarities in amino acid sequences. They may also structurally have some homologous features. What we can then see is if we look down the bottom here at a yeast, for example, in order for us to trace back the closest point, so the closest point where humans up here and yeast down here shared a common ancestor, so an ancestor that a point in time where they were both the same species or stem from the same species, we would need to make our way right back down to this point here. If we compare that to humans and monkeys, this point here is where humans and monkeys were the same or considered the same species. So what you can see in a phylogenetic tree is we have this concept of time which runs along with it as well. One last thing you can see is, for example, up here you might have examples where you have three species. So let's have a sheep, a goat, and a llama. This is hypothetical, but you can have species that, or three species speciate from a common ancestor at a similar point in time along a phylogenetic tree. So phylogenetic trees are really good ways of visually representing how the homologous features and how the similarities or differences of DNA and amino acid structure give us an indication of different evolutionary pathways and relationships between different organisms.